Mr. Khairy Jamaluddin is Minister of Youth and Sports Malaysia and a Member of Parliament representing the Rembau constituency in Negeri Sembilan. He is also leader of UMNO Youth and the chairman of Barisan National Youth. Prior to entering politics, he has worked as a journalist, policy aide, and investment banker. Mr. Khairy was educated at the universities of Oxford and London. The World Economic Forum in Davos selected him as a young global leader in 2005, and he was made an Asia 21 Fellow by the Asia Society in 2006. Mr. Khairy was also selected as visiting fellow at the Oxford Center for Islamic Studies in 2002. And in 2012, he was appointed as chairman of the National Entrepreneurs Development Corporation. And currently, ladies and gentlemen, he serves as an airborne paratrooper and commander of the 508 Regiment in the Malaysian Territorial Army. He is married to Nori Abdullah, and they have 3 sons, Jibril Cougar Ali, Timur Puma Abdullah, and Raif Leo Averos. He may be over 30, but not much. Please give a warm welcome to His Excellency Mr. Khairy Jamaluddin Abu Bakar.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera. Bapak Dino, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'd like to thank Pak Dino and the organizing committee for the Conference on Indonesian Foreign Policy for organizing this. I was always wondering how to make foreign policy more exciting and sexy. And I think Pak Dino is the only person in the world, probably, who can make something like foreign policy exciting and sexy. And I love the way you started the conference with songs. And I think this is something that ASEAN should practice. If we start ASEAN conferences with We Are the World, especially conferences on the South China Sea, I think we can solve the problem. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, I want to echo what Dino and Professor Kishore mentioned about the optimism for ASEAN. But I want to focus on a few things, and I want to focus on the future of ASEAN and some of the things that are important for most of the people in the audience today, young Indonesians, young ASEAN citizens. I want to start off with asking a question about what can we get out of ASEAN? Because as young people, and we saw the video of the man on the street earlier, don't know very much about ASEAN. So the first thing that we need to ask ourselves is, what is in it for me? What can I get from ASEAN? And I think there are many things that we can get from ASEAN. There are many opportunities that we can get from ASEAN. I want to focus on one thing first, which is opportunities for young people in business. And this is really about grassrooting ASEAN, term that was invented by Dino. Maksudnya, we want to see what ASEAN can mean for us as a small business person, as an example of ASEAN and the opportunity that ASEAN brings. I want to start by saying that ASEAN presents a tremendous opportunity for young people, especially small, medium businesses, and in e-commerce. The e-commerce market in ASEAN is set to increase by 15 times over the next 10 years. ASEAN has the potential to be one of the top 5 digital economies in the world by the year 2025. And why do I say this? We need to leverage this because this is the first digital generation of ASEAN. All of you, including myself, we live our lives through our mobile devices. In ASEAN, 133% of our population have mobile penetration or ownership of mobile phones, which means we own more than one phone. And that is the tremendous opportunity that presents itself from ASEAN. And I say tremendous opportunity because we haven't fully leveraged on it yet. Consider the fact that ASEAN SMEs represent about 95% of enterprises in this region are small and medium businesses. But at the same time, exports by SMEs in the region is about 10 to 30%. So the growth potential for small businesses and e-commerce is tremendous. And this is something that you can look at and say, this is something for me. I want to set up a business which leverages on the seamless connectivity a large market of 600 to 700 million people, and a market which can only grow, and a market that makes sense to me as a young person. So the first thing that I want to tell you is that ASEAN makes sense to us. It makes sense to us, not just to the politicians, not just to the diplomats, not just through the communiques, but it makes sense to us. Consider the fact that a Malaysian company, Grab, has now decided to expand its business, not in Malaysia, but here in Indonesia. It acquired a company called Kudo, an e-commerce startup, by connecting people who are offline to their online businesses. And they've invested about $700 million in Indonesia. This is an idea of an ASEAN company looking at the ASEAN market, connecting people who are not connected, and making sure that they leverage on it. That's today. Those are the opportunities that you have today. But the second point that I want to make is we have to look into the future. What are the upcoming challenges for us collectively as ASEAN? I want you to project ASEAN for the next 30 to 50 years. Understand that these big trends are trends that we have to collectively confront together. Trends which we need to understand to future-proof ASEAN. Dino, Kishore both spoke about not taking ASEAN for granted. And that means future-proofing our region. That means understanding the changes that are going to come over the next 30 to 50 years. Urbanization. Consider the fact that global urban population will increase to 70%. 70% of the world's population will live in cities by the year 2050. You'll have new megacities with more than 5 million people in ASEAN. For instance, in Batam, Denpasar, Vientiane, Tasikmalaya. All these cities will rise over the next 20 to 30 years. Limited resources, food and water. At least 1 billion people in Asia will have a shortage of water over the next 20 years. The environment, an increase of more than 50% of greenhouse gases emission by 2050, driven by energy demand. How do we ensure that in ASEAN we keep our greenhouse gas emission and carbon footprint down? An aging population. Yes, Dino said that ASEAN is still young. Half of our population is under the age of 30, but over the next 30 to 50 years, we become an aging population. How do we deal with that? How do we pay for an aging population? Healthcare, pensions, all of us, young still, but we don't imagine how we have to deal with an aging population over the next 20 to 30 years. And of course, geopolitical change. ASEAN will become a partner, not just the world, but how do we balance the rivalry that happens in this part of the world? What I want to say from this, second point, is we need to project into the future and understand. And that is what Dino said just now, the next big thing. The next big thing for ASEAN is to actually have this roadmap for the future. Malaysia has done it. We have this National Transformation 2050, looking at the next 30 years and mapping our strategy. I know Singapore has it through their Smart Nation initiative. The ASEAN has to have this as well. Imagining ASEAN in the next 50 years. The next big thing, Internet of Things, genomics, and all these things, augmented reality, and how we together should start investing in common areas of research into renewable energy, clean energy, and sustainable development. These are things that we haven't spoken of yet. Next is, of course, how do we increase the seamlessness of ASEAN? I want to be able to be in ASEAN where it's seamless, not just to travel, but to set up business, where we don't have to sign on to the local telecommunications company and pay for a ridiculously expensive mobile data package when we come to other ASEAN countries. I want infrastructure that is seamless. I want us to have an infrastructure plan where we develop and commonly develop our ports, our airports, our railway system, so that it's not just for national interest, but it's for the ASEAN interest, where we increase connectivity. We want to make sure that the ASEAN Connectivity Master Plan makes sense to us. Work together with the Asian Infrastructure Bank, work together with the ADB, work together with the World Bank, work together with everybody who wants to increase connectivity in ASEAN, because the future for ASEAN is to ensure that we are seamless, not just in terms of the harmonization of our customs, our laws, our regulation, but in real terms, in traveling, in communicating, and in connectivity. And that's very important for us in order to create an ASEAN community, you have to have connectivity as the backbone. My fourth point is we also have to look at non-state challenges. ASEAN for far too long has been looking at ASEAN issues in the context of countries, in the context of businesses, removing trade barriers, increasing cross-border investments. But what now we have to do is to look at non-state challenges, challenges that come from non-state actors and non-state issues. We've done a great job with anti-terrorism, anti-piracy cooperation, but we need to do much more in terms of non-state challenges that come to us. I'll give you 3 examples. One, in terms of migration. Migration patterns will change over the next 30 to 50 years. Over the last 15 years, migration has increased by 41% globally, and that stands to increase as we become freer, as we become more open in terms of our borders, in terms of the free movement of people within ASEAN. We have to deal with how we manage migration in this region. Secondly, challenges of cybersecurity. Now, national borders are not just physical borders anymore. Sovereignty is not just looking after your physical borders, but also your digital and cyber borders. Southeast Asia has the world's 4th largest internet population, but it has some of the most underdeveloped data protection laws and weak adoption of cybersecurity practices. So how do we deal with this? It's again a non-state issue, a new frontier that we have to deal with. And climate change. As I said earlier, we have to commit ourselves to climate change and to reducing our carbon footprint. And how we do this? Collectively. And this is something that is a major problem for ASEAN. Consider the fact that the only landlocked country in ASEAN is Laos. Everyone else has a coastline. So you imagine the rise in the sea level will result in major problems for ASEAN countries, ASEAN capitals, in terms of flooding, in terms of congestion, and in terms of development. So the point that I want to make, the 4th point, is how do we look at threats and challenges that are not traditional, that are not trade, investments, that are not settled at the level of state, but rather non-state actors. Next, I want to touch on the issue of taking ASEAN for granted. I think Kishore mentioned this, and Dino also mentioned this. We must never ever take ASEAN's success for granted. ASEAN has been a success, a tremendous success, but it will not always be so. We need to learn from Brexit and other parts of the world that are turning inwards. Although the ASEAN project is different from the European Union model, it is important that integration in ASEAN is seen to be fair to all participating countries. ASEAN is a diverse group. The standard deviation of income in ASEAN countries is more than 7 times that of EU countries. And then we have a diversity of language, religion. Indonesia, 90% Muslim. Philippines, 90% Roman Catholic. Thailand, 90% Buddhist. How do we tackle these disparities? How do we ensure that we don't take this success for granted? Now, backlash happens, and it's happened in the UK. It's happened in the United States, where people are turning inwards, when people feel that they are not getting what they should from the status quo. That is why we need a bottom-up approach for the future of ASEAN. For too long, ASEAN has been top-down, and the future must be written by the people. It must be a bottom-up approach where people feel connected. People feel disconnected to the bureaucracy in Brussels and Europe, and that's why they rejected it, and that's why there was a backlash. The people-to-people agenda that we speak of is not just about creating personal links in ASEAN, but it's also for us to have a stake in the future of ASEAN. Next is we need to move away from historical baggage. We've once been the playground for superpower rivalry, and ASEAN must never again be pawns on a big stage. We are stronger together. We all know if ASEAN is a single entity, it will be the 7th largest in the world in terms of GDP, 2nd largest in terms of inbound FDI, 3rd largest population. We are stronger together. So we need to make sure that ASEAN centrality is the bedrock of our foreign policy. Yes, we must ensure that we remain on friendly terms with the great powers, but we must also spread our linkages, engage with other regions, with Europe, with the Middle East, to ensure that this is not a playground for superpowers and never again are we pawns in a bigger game. and there's great potential for us to expand our relationship with countries which are underdeveloped, for instance, ASEAN and India, ASEAN and the Middle East. We also need, ladies and gentlemen, one of my last points, is a new ASEAN way. What do I mean by a new ASEAN way? We need an ASEAN way which is more honest and more open. While we observe the fundamental ASEAN principle of non-interference, if the domestic affairs of a member country results in instability, which affects other countries in the region, we cannot remain silent. That is why Malaysia has taken a very principled and vocal stand on the Rohingya issue. 1.1 million Rohingyas in the Rakhine state have been denied citizenship and live under apartheid-like conditions. The ethnic cleansing that is being reported in Rakhine state is not just an internal problem for Myanmar. The Rohingyas are fleeing their homeland, and this creates a wave of refugees for other ASEAN countries. There is also a threat of radicalization as terror groups take advantage of the persecution by recruiting those who are being targeted. We must remember, ladies and gentlemen, that we have announced to the world that ASEAN is a community of nations committed to human dignity. Our Human Rights Declaration states that every person has an inherent right to personal liberty and security, a right not to be subjected to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. And now we are being tested in our backyard, in ASEAN itself. Now, do we stay silent? Is this for real? Or are these words just on a piece of paper? That is why ASEAN needs to continue to respect tradition, respect non-interference, but we need to be honest with one another. And we need to speak out, especially when these issues affect us. And that brings me to real ASEAN-ness. Coming back to people relationship. I want us to carve an ASEAN identity. ASEAN is a political construct. It is a political idea. It is a political idea that brought together 5 nations at first, and now 10 nations. How can we move from a political construct to a real identity? How can we start calling ourselves ASEANese or ASEANian? I always introduce myself as I'm Malaysian, but I'm also ASEANese because I want to create that identity. We need to start thinking about what can we do? What can we do to solidify that identity? And I've been thinking long and hard about this. I just hosted the Southeast Asia Games, the SEA Games in Malaysia. And I thought sports was a great way to bring us together. And it is. But also sports is a way of getting our rivalry going a bit out of hand. So I was thinking, how can we bring that power of sports or something to create ASEAN identity so that all of us understand, so that when we ask the man on the street about ASEAN, they know ASEAN is 10 countries. They know ASEAN is 50 years old. I thought about an ASEAN boy band. Maybe Dino and I can get back together again and invite people from Thailand and Laos to join us. ASEAN boy band, be crazy. But something that's close to my heart and something that I think is an idea out of the box, which I think can work, which I've been pushing for the last 5 years, is for ASEAN to host the World Cup or the Olympics. You know, imagine, let's do this. Let's do this. You know, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, other ASEAN countries get together. Let's put in a bid. I know the IOC accepting bids from more than one country now. I know the World Cup has accepted a bid from more than one country. Japan and South Korea held the World Cup together. And by the way, if ASEAN holds the World Cup, the Football World Cup, that's the only way our teams are going to qualify for the World Cup. Yeah? So it's a good idea that we do this. So, I mean, this might be a crazy idea, you know, but it's a not so crazy idea. Because when we do the SEA Games, we're at each other's throats. But I think when we do this, there's a sense of solidarity. We have to think about bringing ASEAN down to the level of the people, grassrooting it. And I think this is an idea that I hope you can support for us to bring ASEAN to the people. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, I want to recognize Indonesia for hosting this conference. Indonesia's leadership role for ASEAN as our representative in G20. PricewaterhouseCoopers forecasted Indonesia to be a top 10 economy in the world by 2050. Now, we need Indonesian leadership. And we want Indonesia to play that leading role, like you once did when we formed ASEAN, to drive ASEAN forward for the next 50 years. Remember, ladies and gentlemen, when ASEAN was formed 50 years ago, not many people gave us a chance. People said that this project is not going to succeed. This project will fail. Too different, too diverse, at each other's throats. But we've shown that 50 years later, we're better together. Let's continue to defy expectations. Let's drive ASEAN for another 50 years. And I look to Indonesia and all the other ASEAN countries in making sure that we can continue to defy expectations. Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.